Warriors of Old Japan and Other Stories by Theodora Ozaki. Part 5. The Goblin of Oyeyama. Long, long ago, in Old Japan, in the reign of the Emperor Ichijo, the 66th Emperor, there lived a very brave general called Minamoto no Raiko. Minamoto was the name of the powerful clan to which he belonged, and in England it would be called his surname, and Reiko, or Yoromitsu, was his own name. In those times, it was the custom for generals to keep as a bodyguard 4 picked knights, renowned for their daring spirit, their great strength, and their skill in wielding the sword. These 4 braves were called Shiteno, or 4 Kings of Heaven, and they participated in all the exploits and martial expeditions of their chief, and vied with one another in excelling in bravery and dexterity. Minamoto no Raiko was no exception to the general rule of those ancient leaders of Japan, and he had under him Usui Sadamitsu, Sakata Kintoki, Urabi Suetaki, and Watanabe Tsuna. The clan or surname comes first in Japan. Search the wide world from north to south and from east to west, and no braver warriors than the Shiteno of Minamoto no Raiko could you find. Each one of the 4 was said to be a match single-handed for 1,000 men. They lived for adventure, and their delight was in war. Now, it happened about this time that Kyoto, the capital, was ringing with the stories of the doings of a frightful demon that lived in the fastnesses of a high mountain called Mount Oi, in the province of Tamba. This goblin or demon's name was Shutotendoji. To look upon the creature was a horrible thing, and those who once caught sight of him never forgot the sight to their dying day. He sometimes took it upon him the form of a human being, and leaving his den would steal into the capital and haunt the streets and carry off precious sons and beloved daughters of the Kyoto homes. Having seized these treasures and flowers of the people, he would drag them to his castle in the wilds of Mount Oye, and there he would make them work and wait upon him till he was ready to devour them. Then he would tear them from limb to limb. For a long time, the flower of the youth of the capital had been kidnapped in this way. Many homes had been made desolate. For a long, long time, no one had the least idea of what happened to the sons and daughters thus stolen. But at the period when this story begins, the dread news of the cannibal Shutendoji and his mountain den began to be noised abroad. Now, at the court there was an official, Knight Kimitaka by name, who was thrice happy in the possession of a beautiful daughter. She was his only child, and upon her he and his wife doted. One day the darling of the family disappeared, and no trace whatsoever of the beautiful girl could be found. The household was plunged into the deepest grief and misery. The mother at last determined to consult a soothsayer, and bidding an attendant follow her, she repaired to the house of a famous fortune-teller and diviner, who revealed to her that her daughter had been stolen away by the goblin of Mount Oye. The mother hastened home, terror-stricken, and the father, when he was told of the dire news, was dumb with grief. He gave up going on duty at the palace, for he was so broken-hearted that he could do nothing but weep night and day over the loss of his only daughter. To lose her was bad enough, but the thought of those horrible hands into which she had fallen was unendurable, and all who loved the poor child, even her own father, were powerless to save her. Oh, the bitter, bitter grief. At last the emperor heard of the sorrow that had overtaken Kimitaka, and his wrath was great to think that the hateful goblin had dared to enter the precincts of the sacred capital without permission, and had dared to steal away his subjects in this manner. And in his royal indignation he sprang to his feet, and he threw down his tasselled fan and cried aloud, "Is there no one in my domains who will punish this goblin and destroy him utterly, and avenge the wrongs he has done my people and the city, and so set my heart at ease?" Then the emperor called his council together and put the matter before them, and asked them what it were best to do, for the city must at all costs be rid of this terrible scourge. "How dare he haunt my dominions and lay hands on my people in the very precincts of my palace?" cried the distressed emperor. Then the ministers respectfully answered the emperor, and said, "There are a number of brave warriors in your majesty's realm, but there are none so able to do your bidding as Minamoto no Raiko. We would humbly advise our august emperor, the son of heaven, to send for the knight and command him to slay the dragon. Our poor council may not find it favor in the son of heaven's sight, but at the present moment we can think of nothing else to suggest." This advice pleased Emperor Ichijo, and he answered that he had often heard of Raiko as a valiant knight and true, who knew not what fear was, and he had no doubt that, as his ministers said, he was just the man for the adventure. And so the emperor summoned Raiko to the palace at once. The warrior, on receiving the royal and unexpected summons, hastened to the palace, wondering what it could mean. When he was told what was wanted of him, he prostrated himself before the throne in humble acquiescence to the royal command. Indeed, Raiko was right glad at the thought of the adventure in store for him, for it had been quiet for some time in Kyoto, and he and his braves had chafed at the enforced idleness. The more he realized the awful difficulty of his task, the higher his courage and his spirits rose to face it, and the more he determined to do or die in the attempt. He went home and thought out a plan of action. As the enemy was no human being, but a formidable goblin, he thought that the wisest course were to resort to a stratagem instead of an open encounter. So he decided to take with him a few of his most trusted men rather than a great number of soldiers. He then called together his 4 braves, Kintoki, Sadamitsu, Suetaki, and Tsuna, and besides these other knights by the name Hirai Yasumasa, nicknamed Hitori, which meant, as applied to him, the only warrior. Raiko told them of the expedition and explained that, as the goblin was no common foe, he thought it wise that they should go to the mountain in disguise. In this way, they would more likely and more easily overcome the goblin. They all agreed what their chief said and set about making their preparations with great joy. They polished up their armour and sharpened their long swords and tried on their helmets, rejoicing in the prospect of the action confronting them. Before starting on this dangerous enterprise, they thought it wise to seek the protection and the blessing of the gods. So Raiko and Yasumasa went to pray for help at the temple of Hachiman, the god of war, at Mount Otoko, while Tsuna and Kintoki went to the Sumiyoshi shrine of the goddess of mercy, and Sadamitsu and Suetaki to the temple of Gongjin at Kumano. At each shrine, the 6 knights offered up the same prayer for divine help and strength, and, on bended knees and with hands laid palm to palm, they besought the gods to grant them success in their expedition and a safe return to the capital. Then the brave band disguised themselves as mounted priests They wore priest caps and sacerdotal garments and stoles. They hid their armor and their helmets and their weapons in the knapsacks they carried on their backs. In their right hand they carried a pilgrim's staff, and in their left a rosary, and they wore rough straw sandals on their feet. No one meeting these dignified, solemn-looking priests would have thought that they were on their way to attack the goblin of Mount Oye, and none would have dreamt that the leader of the band was the warrior Raiko, who, for courage and strength, had not his peer in the whole of the island empire. In this way, Raiko and his men travelled across the country till at last they reached the province of Tamba and came to the foot of the mountains of Oye. Now, as the goblin had chosen Mount Oye as his place of abode, you can imagine how difficult of access it was. Raiko and his men had often travelled in mountain districts, but they had never experienced anything like the steepness of Mount Oye. It was indescribable. Great rocks obstructed the way, and the branches of the trees were so thickly interlaced overhead that the light of day could not penetrate through the foliage, even at midday, and the shadows were so black that the warriors would have been glad of lanterns. Sometimes the path led them over precipices, where they could hear the water rushing along the deep ravines beneath. So deep were these chasms that as Raiko and his men passed them, they were sometimes overcome with giddiness. For the first time they realized now the dangers and difficulties of the task they had undertaken, and they were somewhat disheartened. At times they rested themselves on the roots of trees to gain breath. Sometimes they stopped to quench their thirst at some trickling spring, catching the water up in their hands. They did not, however, allow themselves to be discouraged long, but pushed their way deeper and deeper into the mountains, encouraging each other with brave words of cheer when they felt their spirits flagging. But the thought sometimes crossed their mind, though they one and all kept it to themselves. What if Shutendoji or some of his demons should be lurking behind any of the rocks or cliffs? Suddenly, from behind a rock, 3 old men appeared. Now, Raiko, who was as wise as he was brave, and who at that very moment had been thinking of what he should do were they to encounter the goblin unexpectedly, thought that sure enough here were some of the goblins, who had heard of his approach. They had simply disguised themselves as these venerable old men so as to deceive him and his men. But he was not to be outwitted by any such prank. He made signs with his eyes to the men behind him to be on their guard, and they, in obedience to his gesture, put themselves in attitudes of defence. The 3 old men saw at once the mistake Raiko had made, for they smiled at him, and then, drawing nearer, they bowed before him, and the foremost one said, "Do not be afraid of us. We are not the goblins of this mountain. I am from the province of Setsu. My friend is from Ki, and the third lives near the capital. We have all been bereft of our beloved wives and daughters by Shutendoji the goblin. Because of our great age, we can do nothing to help them, though our sorrow for their loss, instead of growing less, grows greater day by day. We have heard of your coming, and we have awaited you here so that we might ask you to help us in our distress. It is a great favor we ask, but we entreat you, if you encounter Shutendoji, to show him no mercy, but to slay him, and so avenge the wrongs of our wives and children and many others who have been torn away from their homes in the flower capital." Raiko listened attentively to all the old man said, and then answered, "Now that you have told me so much, I need not reserve the truth from you." And he went on to tell them of the order he had received from the emperor to destroy Shutendoji and his den. And the warrior did his best to comfort the old men and to assure them that he would do all in his power to restore their kidnapped wives and daughters. Then the old men expressed great joy. Their faces beamed like the sun, and they thanked Ryoko warmly for his kind sympathy. And they presented him with a jar of sake, saying as they bowed low, "As a token of our gratitude, we wish to present you with this magic wine. It is called Shimban Kidokushu. The name means a cordial for men, but a poison to goblins. Therefore, if a demon drinks of this wine, all his strength will go for him, and he will be as one paralyzed. Before you attack Shuten Joji, give him to drink of this wine, and for the rest you will find no difficulty." And with these words, the venerable spokesman handed the warrior a small white stone jar containing the wine. As soon as Ryoko had taken the jar into his hands, a radiance like that of sunlight suddenly shone round the old men, and they vanished upwards from sight till their shining figures were lost in the clouds. The warriors were struck with astonishment. They gazed upwards as if stupefied, but Ryoko was the first to recover from his surprise. He clapped his hands and he laughed and he said, "Ha ha! Be not afraid at what you have seen. Be sure that the three who thus appeared to us are none other than gods of the shrines we visited before starting on this perilous enterprise. The old man who said he was from Setsu must have been the deity of Sumiyoshi. The one from the province of Ki was the divinity of Kumano, and the one from the capital, the god Hachiman of Mount Otoko. This is a most propitious sign. The three deities have taken us under their special protection. This sake is their gift, and it will surely be of magic power in helping us to overcome the demons. We must, therefore, render thanks to heaven for the protection vouchsafed to us." Then Raiko and his 5 knights knelt down on the mountain pass and bowed themselves to the ground and prayed for some minutes in silence, overcome with awe at the thought that these 3 gods whose aid they had invoked had visited them. Raiko sprang to his feet and lifted the jar of sake reverently above his head. Then he placed it with his armor and weapons in the box he carried on his back. Having done this, they all proceeded on their way. But oh, how safe and confident they now felt. Ryoko, with his magic wine, felt more than a match for any demon now. There is a proverb which says, "A giant with an iron rod," which means strength added to strength, and this was fully illustrated in the case of Ryoko. The goblin Shutendoji was now to be pitied. It would surely go hard with him. As they sped on their way, they came to a mountain stream, and here they found a damsel washing a blood-stained garment. And as she watched and beat the garment against the current, they saw that she had to stop and wipe the tears away with her sleeve, for she was weeping bitterly. Raiko's heart was stirred with pity at her distress, and he went up to her and said, "This is a goblin-haunted mountain. How is it that I find a damsel such as you here?" The princess, for such she was, looked up in his face wonderingly and said, "It is indeed true that it is a goblin-haunted mountain, and hitherto inaccessible to mortals. How is it that you have managed to get here?" And she looked from Ryoko to his men. Then Ryoko said, "I will tell you the truth quite frankly. The emperor has commanded us to slay the demon. That is why we are here." Without waiting to hear any more, the princess ran up to Ryoko in her joy and clung to him, crying out in broken sentences, "Are you indeed the great Ryoko of what I have heard so often? How thankful I am that you have come. I will be your guide to the goblin's den. Hasten, knight Ryoko, and kill the demons. I already feel that I am saved." When they heard these words, the warriors knew that she was one of the goblin's victims. The princess turned and led the way up the hill. Presently they saw a large iron gate guarded by 2 demons. The demon on the right was red, and the demon on the left was black, and each was armed with a great iron stick or club. The princess whispered to Raiko, "Behold the home of the demon. Enter the gates, and you will find a beautiful palace built of black iron from the foundations to the roof. It is therefore called the Palace of Black Iron, or Kurogani. It is large, and the inside is as beautiful as a great daimyo's place. Within the walls of the Palace of Black Iron, Shuten Doji holds a feast night and day. He is waited upon by maidens such as I, whom he has carried off from the capital and from the provinces to be his slaves. The wine he drinks, poured out in crimson lacquer cups, is the blood of human beings, and the food of those feasts is the flesh of his victims who are slain in turn. What numbers I have seen disappear, alas, all murdered to supply the awful food and wine of those cannibal feasts. How I have prayed to heaven to punish this monster, but when I saw the fate of my friends, how could I hope to live? I knew not when my turn would come, but since I have met you, I feel that we shall all be saved, and great is my joy and gratitude." By this time they had reached the gate, and the princess went forward and said to the red and black demon sentinels, "These poor travellers have lost their way on this mountain. I took compassion on them and brought them here, so that they may rest for a while before going on their journey. I hope you will be kind to them." When the princess first began to speak, the demons looked and saw Raiko and his fellow priests, little dreaming who these men were, and that in admitting them they were letting in the bravest knights in the whole of Japan, and still less suspecting their purpose. The demons laughed in their hearts. Good prey had indeed fallen into their hands. They would surely be allowed a share in the feast of these fresh victims. They grinned from ear to ear at the princess and told her that she'd done well, and bade her to take the 6 travellers into the palace and inform Shutendoji of their arrival. Thus the 6 warriors entered into the very stronghold of the demons, as if they were invited guests. Triumphant glee at the success of their plan made them exchange lightning glances with each other. They passed through the great iron gate, up to the porch, and then the princess led them through a large, spacious rooms and along great corridors, till at last they reached the inner part of the palace. Here they were shown to a large hall. At the upper end, the seat of honor, sat the demon king, Shuten Doji. Never had the knights in their wildest dreams dreamt of such a hideous monster. He was 10 feet in height. His skin was bright red, and his wild shock of hair was like a broom. He wore a crimson hakama, and he rested his huge arms on a stand. As the knights entered, he glared at them fiercely with eyes as big as a dish. The sight of this dread monster was enough to make anyone tremble with fear, and had Raiko and his knights been weak, they must have fainted away with horror. Raiko could hardly restrain himself from flying at the monster then and there, but he controlled himself and bowed humbly so as not to awaken the enemy's suspicion in any way. Shutendoji, glaring at him, said haughtily, "I do not know who you are in the least, or how you have found your way into this mountain, but make yourself at home." Then Raiko answered meekly, "We are only humble mountain priests from Mount Haguro of Dewa. We were on our way to the capital, having been on a pilgrimage to the shrine of Omine. In traveling across the mountain, we have lost our way. While wandering about and wondering which was the right path to take, we were met by one of your inmates of your palace and kindly brought here. Please pardon us for trespassing on your domains and for all the trouble we are giving you." "Don't mention it," said Shutendoji. "I am sorry to hear of your plight. Do not stand on ceremony while you are here. Let us feast together." Then turning to the attendant demons, he shouted orders for the dinners to be served and clapped his red hands together. At this, the partitions between the rooms slid apart and beautiful damsels, magnificently robed, came gliding in, bearing aloft in their hands large wine cups, jars of sake, and dishes of fish of all kinds, which they placed before the ugly goblins and the guests. Raiko knew that all these lovely princesses had been snatched from the flower capital by Shutendoji, who, heedless of their tears and misery, kept them here to be his handmaidens. He said to himself fiercely that they should soon be free. Now that the wine cups were brought in, the warriors seized his opportunity. From his satchel he took out the jar containing the enchanted wine, Shimben Kidoku Shu, which he had received from the gods of those 3 shrines, and said to Shutendoji, "Here is some wine which we have bought from the Mount Haguro. It is a poor wine and unworthy of your acceptance, but we have found it of great benefit in refreshing us when we were weary from fatigue, and in cheering our drooping spirits. It will give us much pleasure if you will try a little of our humble wine, though it may not please your taste." Shutendoji seemed pleased at this courtesy. He handed out a huge cup to be filled, saying, "Give me some of your wine. I should like to try it." The goblin drained it at one swallow and smacked his lips over it. "I have never tasted such excellent wine," he said, and held out his cup to be filled again. You can imagine how delighted Raiko was, for he knew full well that what the demon was given into his hand, but he dissembled cleverly and said as he filled the goblin's wine cup, "I am delighted that the honourable host should deign to like our poor country wine. While you drink, I and my companions will venture to amuse you by our dancing." Then Raiko made a sign to his men, and they began to chant an accompaniment, while he himself danced. Shutendoji was highly amused, as well as his attendants. They had never seen men dance before, and they thought that the strangers were very entertaining. The goblins now began to pass the magic wine around and grow merry. Others, meanwhile, whispered amongst themselves, pitying the 6 travellers who, all unconscious of the horrible fate which was about to overtake them, were spending their last hours of liberty and probably of life in giving wine to their slayers and in dancing and singing for their amusement. Already, however, the power of the enchanted wine had begun to work, and Shutendoji grew drowsy. The wine in the jar never seemed to grow less. However, much was taken from it, and by this time all the demons had helped themselves liberally. At last they all fell into a deep sleep, and stretching themselves out on the floor and on one another, some in one corner and some in another, they were soon snoring so loudly that the room shook, and were as insensible to all that was going on as logs of wood. "The time has come," said Raiko, springing to his feet and motioning his men to get to work. One and all hastily opened their knapsacks. Taking out their helmets, their armour, and their long swords, they armed themselves. When they were all ready, they all knelt down, and placing their hand palm to palm, they prayed fervently to their patron gods to help them now in their hour of greatest need and peril. As they prayed, a shining light filled the room, and in a radiant cloud the 3 deities appeared again. "Fear not, warrior Raiko," they said. "We have tied the hands and the feet of the demon fast, so you have nothing to fear. While your knights cut off his limbs, do you cut off his head, then kill the rest of the Oni, and your work will be done." The 3 old men had disappeared as mysteriously as they had come. Raiko rejoiced at the vision and worshipped with his heart full of gratitude the vanishing deities. The knights then rose from their knees, took their swords, and wet the rivets with water so as to fix the blade firmly in the hilt. Then they all stole stealthily and cautiously towards Shutendoji. No longer the timid mountain priests clad in full armour, they were transformed into avenging warriors. With flashing eyes and dauntless mien, they moved across the room. The captive princesses standing round realized that these men were deliverers from their beloved capital. Their joy and wonder cannot be put into words. Some cried aloud with joy, others covered their faces with their sleeves and burst into soft weeping. Others raised their hands to heaven and exclaimed, "Ah, Buddha, come to hell! Surely these brave men will kill the demons and set us free!" And with clasped hands they entreated the knights to slay their captors and take them back to their homes. Now, Raiko stood over the sleeping Shutendoji with drawn sword, and raising it on high, with a mighty sweep he aimed at the demon's neck, which was as big round as a barrel. The head was severed from the body at one blow, but, horrible to relate, instead of falling to the ground, it flew up into the air in a great rage. It hung over Raiko for a moment, snorting flames of fire, and then swooped down as if it would bite off the warrior's head. But it was daunted by the glittering star on his helmet, and drew back and gazed in surprise at the transformed man. Raiko was scorched by the demon's flaming breath. Once more he raised his longsword and, striking the terrible head, brought it to the ground at last. The noise of the combat and the triumphant shouts of the warriors awoke the other demons, who roused themselves as quickly as their stupefied senses allowed them. They were in great fright, and without waiting to get their iron clubs, they made a rush upon Raiko. But they were too late. His 5 braves dashed in and attacked them right and left, until in a few minutes there was not one left to tell the tale of the destruction which had come down upon them like the autumn whirlwind upon the leaves of the forest glades. The captive princess, when they saw their captors were all slain, jumped about with gladness, waving their long sleeves to and fro as the tears of joy streamed down their pale faces. They ran to Raiko and caught hold of his sleeves and praised him, saying, "Oh, Raiko-sama, what a brave and noble knight you are! We are indeed grateful for you to having saved our lives. Never have we seen such a wonderful warrior." And with many such expressions of joy, they gathered round the knight, and their merry voices were now heard instead of the groans of the dying cannibals. Now that Shutendoji was vanquished with all his horde, the way was quite open for Raiko and his men to take the fair captives away from the Castle of Horror and make their way back to the capital as soon as possible. First of all, Raiko tied up the head of Shutendoji with a strong rope and told the 5 brave knights to carry it. Then, followed by the princesses, the little band left Mount Oye forever and set out on the homeward journey. When they reached Kyoto, the news of Raiko's return spread like fire, and the people came out in crowds to welcome the heroes. When the parents of the long-lost damsels saw their daughters again, they felt as if they must be dreaming. It seemed too good to be true that the dear and the cherished ones should be restored to them safe and well, and they overwhelmed Raiko with praise and with precious gifts. Raiko took the head of Shutendoji to the emperor and told him of all that had happened to him. You may be sure that when His Majesty heard of the success which had crowned Raiko and his expedition, he awarded him great praise and merit, and bestowed upon him higher court rank than ever. In all the country, far and near, Raiko's name was in everyone's mouth, and he was acknowledged to be the greatest warrior in the land. Even in the lonely country places, there was not one poor farmer who did not know of the brave deeds of the great general. Ever since then, his portrait is familiar to the boys of Japan, for it is often painted on their kites. End of Part 5. If you have been enjoying these audiobooks, please subscribe That would really help the station. You may also leave a like or a comment, or share these stories with your friends. Thank you.